Have you ever seen one of these? If you have, I bet you're scared. I know I am. Every single time. They just know how to get you. What about this guy? You wouldn't want him to have a bone to pick with you. That's for sure. Ooh, and what about them? Yeah, everybody knows them. And you know what's funny? Nobody likes them. Greedy little violent misers. And how about that? Yeah, that's something you don't see every day. A big 3-star troll breathing heavily upon you. Anyway, there's some beauty. Because this Valheim game is beautiful. And in this beautiful world, my plan is to survive 100 days. I guess we'll see how many bosses I can clean up in that amount of time. Yep, those bosses are scary. But funny enough, almost not as scary as one of the mods I decided to add. I don't know why I did it, but along with some quality of life stuff, I set it so that enemies could go up to 5 stars. And now, after 100 days, I think I can definitively say you shouldn't do that. So before I could get the 100-day counter started, I had to pick a look. And for me, even though I have a great appreciation for a nice crumb catcher, it was a no-brainer. A beard of the majestic variety. And my suspicion is that still, not a crumb would be fumbled. I then gave myself an authentic Viking name and set off in the clutches of a giant crow. His grasp was tough but fair on my mortal skin. And I also greatly appreciated that he refrained from taking care of business for the entirety of our flight. He had picked me up from a far-off battlefield just to drop me in the midst of a stone hit list. And as I'm not one to take my hit list lightly, I took a good look around and committed to memory all these characters, fated to meet my Viking blade. And you could tell I meant business, as I immediately started gathering squishy berries and stones and sticks and stuff. Yeah, I wasn't exactly building a tough guy reputation in the realm just yet, but I did start working on my sneak, and that would eventually fill my belly with something other than squishy berries. So yeah, I started there. I hunted boars. Then I moved on to the big business of scouting. Location is what it's all about here. You never want to be too far from a black forest in the early game. And I took some time to take a sniff around and enjoy the view of a brand new playthrough. And even give a ponder at why there's a big branch in the sky. But I couldn't take too long, as these woodland creatures wouldn't be pacifying themselves. And that was my first big focus. I needed to build up a good base of meat to eat and rags to clothe my sensitive Viking skin. And none did this quite as well in the beginning as the boar. These brutish little miscreants, unlike the deer, have the audacity to think they have a chance in a fight, which proves to be good because you don't have to chase them around the forest to take their skin. Then, in a dilapidated building, I had my very first toasty little fire to get my rested buff. And that building just so happened to have some bees from which I'd violently steal their queen for my future honey supply. And later that night I found the worst the meadows could throw at me on day 1, with the fleshless undead warrior. My club still made short work of him though. I did, however, spot the glowing eyes of an enemy I was definitely not yet ready for. The brute of the Black Forest. On day 2, I discovered that this little starting island of mine had a mountain. And of course I kept my distance, as I had absolutely no desire to be ravaged by wolves just yet. Then, as you do in Valheim, I took another rest and spent some time looking at the map to really make sure I'd be locking into a good spot. 100 days is a long time after all, and moving a base later can be a real pain in the beard. So I wandered and wandered until a nasty fog rolled in, which makes real estate shopping very difficult. But eventually, that fog lifted and revealed a mighty fine looking island. So my real estate shopping was done. At that point, I merely had to eliminate anything that moved and do some clear cutting. Yes, I was excited as I double-checked my map to reconfirm that this was indeed a nice looking island. Then I got to craft an crude bow and use that all night long. On day 3, I began laying the foundation for my starter cabin. It wouldn't be anything fancy, very bare bones, but still strong wall to hold back blade and arrow, and strong roof to hold back wind and rain. And despite all this activity that I was showing, enemy deer, boar, and meadows creatures continued to aggress onto my island. It's like they still thought it was their home or something. Yeah, they made it so weird. Like, it almost felt awkward to cook their flesh and chew on it to sustain myself. Classic toxic narcissists, I think. They always seem to make it about them. Anyway, after killing everything on my island, I almost died to a tree. It's good my health bar was nice and full from eating all those self-indulgent deer. Then that night I continued working on my hut, and even got a beehive down to start working on that honey. As day 4 began, I returned from a night of chopping wood, and then again continued to cull the local deer population. And with all that extra deer hide on hand, it was time to upgrade my workbench. I was about to complete the piece that would finish covering my body head to toe in leather. And as everyone knows, there is nothing cooler than wearing as much leather as humanly possible. And with all that leather-generated confidence bursting, I set off to the boss, Eikthyr. I had definitely gathered enough antlers over the previous days, but I was in for quite a hike to get to one of those altars. So hike I did, and I also used it as an opportunity to explore more of the uncharted portions of the starting island. And finally, as night set in, I took shelter in a shack nearby the altar, got myself a full rested buff, and I was ready. It was time to fight an electric deer. The altar flatulated a pink smoke which vaporized into the ether. The particles all reassembled atop a hill next to an oak tree. But I was ready with my first shot. I had brought plenty of fire arrows with me. I crafted them from the resin I had scraped from the body of all the greylings leading up to this moment. And oh, how that resin burned. And sure, this deer did get a couple good shots on me. But I kept my aim true right across the beard. And kept shooting. Until finally, I landed that burning decisive shot. And then for all my efforts, I got some stuff that would help me crack open that black forest. And the head of Eikthyr himself. The first thing I did on day 5 was get that chainy cranium of Eikthyr back to the hit list stones. It was a very nice looking head. Seemed a shame that only Odin gets to have one in his stones here and I don't get one for my own cabin, but I moved on. What I really wanted was to activate that Eikthyr power anyways. That would give me a nice boost to stamina. And I had a mod I was trying out which gives each power only a quarter of its strength, but it makes it passive as well. Then I took a good look at my next enemy. A tree man of sorts, with large overcompensating for something shoulder pads. Then I fought my way back through the meadows, took a little break under some stones, and had Eiktyr's altar pinkly flatulate just one more time. I figured it would be a while until I was back in the neighborhood, and something just didn't feel right about Odin being the only one with an Eikthyr head to show for all my efforts. So I claimed one for my island. But on my way back home, I saw the sun glisten through the trees and wondered, was I adding suffering to this world all just to serve my vanity? And you know what? I swear I would have got to the bottom of that question. But I came across a group of boars. And man, do I love collecting their hide. Then later that evening, as I was arriving back to my island, I realized that there would be ramifications to my actions. As with taking out Eikthyr, I had disrupted the balance. and I saw then the glowing blue eyes of a grey dwarf roaming the meadows. On day 6, it was time to cross a small waterway on the west side of my island, as I could see a black forest just beyond it. And conveniently, there was a borestone just on the other side, which would be nice for a steady supply of rags and meat. Then I found an old barnhouse-looking building. I figured it would do well as a base camp between my island and the Black Forest. And it already had a chest that I could use for storage too. But then as I stood outside my new outpost, I could hear sounds coming from inside the forest. It would seem something inside had as much an affinity as I for collecting skin and meat from boar. But I figured whatever it was, it would be quite harmless. So I began gathering tin very loudly in this quiet forest. I would need a lot of it so I could combine it with copper to make bronze. But eventually, all this tin mining led me into a group of skeletons. And it wouldn't have been so bad if one of them wasn't a 2-star, which had me nervous. I was still in starter rag armor after all. I thought I had a good start to the fight, but there were just too many of them, and it was difficult to time the blocks. They eventually got me real good, so I had to run. And I figured, why run out of the forest to lose your pursuers when you could just run deeper into it? And then I ducked away into some burial chambers, because what could go wrong hiding from the undead in the very place that they were buried? And you know what? It didn't take me long to find the answer to that question, because it turns out a lot could go wrong doing that. It happened real quick, and luckily I heard the archers fire when I did. But they had me up against the wall and forced me back out to my original pursuers with only 13 health left. I had no choice but to run yet again, though still I felt pressed to stay in that forest. Eventually I used a kiting tactic to thin them out one by one, until it was just me and the 2-star. He was much easier to handle without his entourage. But I still decided to give him one good shot to see if I could block it. And he hit hard. I was glad to see him gone. Then I thought about going back into the chambers. But all this fighting had shown me I was not ready for that just yet. I'd go looking for copper to make better armor instead. And this, of course, came with its own set of challenges. But eventually I found a nice big chunk of it. And I got a couple pieces of copper before I was rudely interrupted. A brute and a whack of grey dwarfs chased me off of that copper vein and pursued me voraciously. They left me with no option but to fight back. And although I had some very well-timed blocks, and I mean that brute must have been getting frustrated with me, they eventually whittled me down and forced my hand to retreat up to my outpost rooftop, where I did my own little whittling away on them. I began day 7 chopping away at some pine trees in the Black Forest. I was already there from the night before and figured I'd gather some core wood. On my way back, I spotted a 2-star brute, and I had no interest in finding out if I stood a chance against him just yet. Then when I returned back to my little home island, I cooked up some food. And I'm really good at it. I never burn it. I placed down a tanning rack to upgrade my workbench, and collected some charcoal I had been drying by the fire. And then I combined the core wood from earlier with some deer heads and pig skins to craft the stagbreaker. And made myself a deer hide cape while I was at it. It made my back feel nice and warm and felt very appropriate to wear while I was hunting deer. Then I tested the stagbreaker on an intrusive boar. My hope was that it would give me an edge in the burial chambers of the Black Forest. It looked like it had some promise. And speaking of the Black Forest, I headed back in, and was immediately pursued by that 2-star brute I had spotted earlier. I figured I was really good at blocking by now, so I gave it a shot and decided to never do that again. Rooftop whittling would yet again be my only hope. On day 8, it was time to take the stagbreaker into action. So I broke in a couple practice swings on a skeleton outside the burial chambers and headed back in. It was quiet at first, but I quickly noticed a little 3-star ghost approaching from the corner. And a sight like that, well, it managed to terrify me and stagbreaker here right to the core wood. I kept swinging, but they eventually had me backed up through the door. I took some time to heal up outside and think of a reason not to go back in. But I really needed those surtling cores, which are only found inside the burial chambers. And because of that, I couldn't find a compelling reason not to go back in. Until that 3-star ghost popped around the corner and hit me. I found that to be a very compelling reason not to go back in. I was forced to come up with a new plan. I couldn't upgrade to bronze armor without the surtling cores from within the burial chambers. But I couldn't take something like this 3-star ghost on without the bronze armor. So I figured the only way forward would be to gather a whole bunch of core wood from here in the Black Forest. And since I was already here, I mined some copper as well. And then took all that back home, where that night I upgraded the stagbreaker for some extra offensive power. And while I was at that, upgraded my shield too. I also squeezed in some time to do some wood chopping and hunted a couple sleepy seagulls for their feathers. On day 9, I approached that burial chamber with intention and practiced my stag blocking skills outside the door. I anticipated going into a bit of an ambush with all of them crowded around the door when I was last in. And though it wasn't as bad as I thought, as I was able to go for the archers right away, that ghost still ended up hitting me like a brick, forcing me to retreat this burial chamber where I would once again shamefully heal myself outside. At this point, I had lost count of how many dishes of shame that 3-star ghost had fed to me. Only his miscalculation was that I would start to nourish myself on that shame. It strengthened my very bones, and I grew stronger and more determined. And I'll tell you what I felt no shame about. When I started cheesing him and making him run back and forth while I shot him with my bow. You can say what you want. Write a comment right now if you want. Say, Oki, you are a shameless man. I don't mind. Because by the end of it, that chamber was 3-star ghostless. And guess what I eventually found? Yep. The prize of surtling cores. Those glowing red beauties had been waiting for me all along. As well as the veggie visor that gave me the Elder's location, which unfortunately also seemed to be really far away. I then continued to fight my way through the chamber and collect all the surtling cores as I went. I then used the energy trapped within those cores to create a kiln and a smelter. And I couldn't have felt more accomplished about that. I was on my way to bronze. As day 10 began, it was obvious I was eagerly awaiting the first plopping out of copper from my smelter. It was easy to just sit there and stare at it. But if I did that, more copper wouldn't just mine itself. And I'd need a lot if I was going to make a whole bronze armor set. So I headed back into the Black Forest. And I found some carrot seeds. And carrots are a massive upgrade in and of themselves. I also gathered some blueberries, fought off some skeletons, and found a new fresh copper vein, which I mined all day. That night I kept the smelter and kiln going constantly, until I finally had enough copper bars to make my forge. And with the forge, I made my first, of many to come, bronze bars. And then I rubbed those bronze bars all over my squishy Viking body in the form of the bronze plate tunic. And it didn't look half bad either. I far more confidently approached the Black Forest that night, and gladly fought grey dwarfs and brutes off of my copper vein. On the morning of day 11, I returned from all that fighting and copper mining, and got back to the delting of the smelting, but noticed I had run low on wood with all that kiln action. So I mainly just made it a lumber day. On day 12, I spotted a tower in the Black Forest and decided to wipe the inhabitants of it, for no reason other than regional dominance. And I got a little gold out of the deal too. I also finished off picking at that copper deposit. And then on my return back with what I had gathered, I learned that my bees even defend themselves. I barely even had to finish a grayling off for them. With all the extra copper I had brought back, I crafted more bronze. And I turned that bronze into an axe. And that wasn't just any axe, because with a bronze axe, I would for the first time be able to harvest birch and oak tree. And from those trees, I could extract the finest of woods in the realm. And I did that pretty much all day and all night. And I did that not just because the fine wood would open up a whole bunch of new tools and weapons, but because it would also allow me to start building portals. But for portals, I'd need a lot of surtling cores too. So I made some bronze plate leggings in anticipation of having to dive some more burial chambers. On day 13, with some new cold bronze against my legs, I headed back into the Black Forest. And with all this extra protection on me, I felt fearless even in the face of a 3-star skeleton archer. I rushed right at him, and I tell ya, if my blocks weren't so perfect, he would have even had a chance to test this armor. His sword-wielding counterpart did, on the other hand, get a chance to test the armor. And yeah, it hurt quite a bit. He left me no choice but to play Ring Around the Rosie with him while I wore him down bit by bit. And filling his pockets full of posies was all worth it, to find rooms absolutely stacked with more surtling cores. I then headed back to my Black Forest outpost where I built my very first portal. And then built one on my home island. And I was very excited to barely ever have to swim across that passage ever again. The first thing I did on day 14 was give that portal a spin. It seemed enigmatic in its nature, yet pragmatic in its application. Then I got to chopping up some more pine trees to gather some core wood. But I must have been making an awful racket, because something big was on its way. My first troll spotting. And he had my scent in his big nose. I fired immediately but missed, and then switched to my flint arrows for extra damage. And they hit him hard. But before I could finish him off, I had to deal with a couple grey dwarfs who tried to throw a stone in my troll parade. And by the time I had dealt with them, I was kind of nervous because I had lost him in the thick brush somewhere. But I seeked and I did find him. I don't think I'm ever not nervous with the first troll. They just catch up to you so fast and leave very little room for error. I was so nervous I misfired over his shoulder as he got close, and nearly sealed my fate as a shot clipped onto a small fir tree. But with a quick last effort, I bagged my first troll. And then I felt my Viking tummy rumble. So I made a cauldron to open up some new recipes. The Queen's Jam has always been a personal favorite. Then with all that extra smoke filling up my abode, I figured it was time to open up the roof a little bit. It was a practical move, but I think it even made the place look a little nicer. And I started feeling snooty about it. Like Queen's Jam kind of snooty. But I had to get my snooty upturned nose back into that Black Forest. And there, I think a bear must have smelt that jam on me, because it popped out of nowhere and attacked. And I was actually more scared of this bear than a troll. I had never faced one before, as they were just introduced in the latest update. And maybe because I was still startled at its popping out at me, I decided to run away. And eventually, I'd face some of my more familiar foes, and they harassed me while I tried to mine some more copper for the day. And then, as night was setting in and I was trying to get out of the Black Forest, I spotted another bear. 2-star, though. And it offered me a very compelling route widely to the right. Yeah, that Black Forest at night was a very spooky place. But I stayed in that spooky place all night and happily welcomed the sunrise on day 15. And shortly after that, curiosity got the best of me. I spotted a bear and felt like I just needed to find out how to fight them. The key, I figured, would be learning the timing of how to block their attacks. And I learned the hard way that it seemed their attack was always delayed from their first movement. And it definitely hit hard. I then decided I had learned enough, and noticed I had been doing all this with no rested buff, so it was time to escape. And that turned out to not be that easy either, as I ran right into a troll, with no stamina and half health. Luckily, a skeleton shot at me and pulled their attention enough for me to slip away. Later that day, I crafted a cultivator out of bronze and core wood, and used it to start a plantation of birch trees. And I also put down a vegetable garden where I could start growing those carrot seeds that I had been gathering. Then I crafted a bronze helmet to complete my bronze armor set. With all this metal abounding, I dare say I could be considered tanky at this point. Maybe even bear ready. Oh, and would you look at that, I found one. Oki the Bear Slayer is what they'd call me, I thought. If there were any they in this realm to call me anything. Yeah, this time was going to be different. I felt like I was beginning to read his movements. Really understand the mind behind the bear. And I liked that they had a high resistance to arrows. Really forced you to get up close and personal with the bear. It made me feel like I earned it, as I went and collected my first ever bear hide. And I think a little bit of that went to my head, as I got slightly too comfortable with the troll that night, and almost ended up losing my own hide. On day 16, I started off with some near-death breathing exercises to calm my nerves. Then actually calmed my nerves by appreciating a nice sunrise that would break the darkness from the night before. I did some tin mining, broke into a new copper deposit that I'd even end up using as a resting spot, and began the evening chopping and collecting wood by my Black Forest outpost. This was squared up to be quite the perfect day. Oh, but then I saw the wrecking ball coming. A 3-star brute. By far the strongest enemy I'd seen up till now. And although I got a couple good shots on him before he got up to me, I had barely scratched him. And then despite me having a perfect block, he did more than half my health and damage. I'd have a near zero fighting chance against him. And as I jumped to the roof, I realized he'd even be able to reach me up there. So I had no choice but to abandon my Black Forest outpost. But on day 17, I didn't let the previous night keep me down. I had been gathering so much materials that I finally had enough to build something that would change my life forever. The Carve. And this puppy was a metal magnet. It was really going to open up a lot of options for me. So I set off for the first time in search of new metallic pastures. I wasn't planning on going too far. I just needed somewhere I could leave my ship while I load it with metal. And just as a storm rolled in, I found a nice looking rock. Then as I landed atop that rock, a bear appeared from the bush and attacked me. But I was starting to get the hang of these bears, so I slew it and named that landing Bear Rock. Standing atop that rock, I was ready to begin my mining operation. And I started immediately. It was so nice not having to run all that metal back to my island one load at a time. And I even made sure to clear the area of Greydorf nests, so that I wouldn't be running into too many enemies. And speaking of enemies, I ran into another bear. But with this one, I could tell he was blown away by my skill of knowing how to deal with him. I could just read it all over his face, you know? He was like, whoa, how does a Viking get so strong and maintain such a wonderful, majestic beard? And as I slayed him that night, that look of wonderment was fixed upon his face in that moment, and I collected his head as my bear trophy. On day 18, I continued my full swing mining operation, and even added in a little wood chopping action while I was there. Even though it was night, I was really enjoying my time over at Bear Rock. I'm not saying it wasn't spooky, but it was ever so slightly serene. And with all that serenity, I had to spend another day. I mean, look at all this copper. And look at this. I dug out underneath the copper and then gave it a boop from up top and watched it crumble from underneath me. Needless to say, that carve was starting to look pretty stacked. On day 20, I needed something to give me a little pep in my step. Maybe a face fastened in a state of perpetual admiration for me. Yeah, that sounded good. So I put down that old bear carcass from earlier. It had quite a depth to its stare, a composition of terror and delight, compulsion and intrigue. I was locked in its mesmerizing gaze. But, again, that copper doesn't mind itself. So I got back to swinging my pick. I had my carve boat to fill up after all. And even though a group of startup skeletons tried to come in and throw a bone in my sails, I dealt with them, one by one. I was a man about business. Copper business. And yeah, maybe I got lucky this one just barely missed taking my head off. But that was his mistake. And I'd make him pay for it. Anyway, my carve was pretty much full of metal. And yeah, I could have left right then and there and been a happy man. But who among us doesn't like just a little bit more? Only in this case, that little bit more would come at a cost. A 1-star troll was guarding my return to Bear Rock that night. And he started tracking me through the forest. Eventually I had no choice and had to fire the first shot. But then he came up on me like a storm from the sea. He was swinging that gigantic log and actually got me really good. But with the cold debuff and already running out of stamina, I thought this might be it for me. He kept swinging, but finally out of nowhere a skeleton came and distracted him. And that was the only opening I needed. I quickly fought a couple Greydorfs off of Bear Rock and took what I could while I could get out of there. And it was a good thing I got out of there. As just as I was leaving, I spotted the silhouette of a bear, taking back my rock. I didn't much like that stupid rock anyways. The next morning I arrived with the biggest metal shipment of the run thus far. And you know what? I must have been pretty excited about that. I had tons of coal ready to get the smelting started. And I began so quickly, so excitedly, that I barely had a chance to look over at my rested buff dwindling. And a moment after I lost that, forests do what forests do. And this one started moving. I scrambled. And at this point I had noticed I was unrested. I had no choice but to fight as I was. But man, were they overwhelming. I tried a bunch of different approaches, but they just kept nipping at me, and my health bar started lacking. It was that poison from the shamans. I just couldn't get away from it. And they were relentless with it. But I couldn't just give in. This was my island now. And I had to persevere. I wasn't about to let them do me like the Black Forest. So I dealt with them. And then got back to smelting. Who can stop by and forgot on this island that we choose our words carefully. He misspoke and meant to say I had almost been invaded. I kept my smelters going for the rest of the day. And that night I stared deeply into the fire and thought about some stuff. Just normal Viking stuff. Nothing about any rock that had been stolen from me or anything like that. And when I cooked bear meat in front of my bear rug, that wasn't vindictively motivated. No one can prove that wasn't just simple coincidence. Lashing out at a bear rug because of what some other bear had done, I was above that. But since we were on the topic, I figured I might go check on the portal at Bear Rock. Quickly. And it went poorly. The bear had been waiting just as expected. And I could have taken him, but he brought backup. A lot of them. And they chased me deeper into the forest. They were between me and the portal. And the deeper they chased me, the spookier things got. My greatest fear was that I would run into that one-star troll. And then I ran into that one-star troll. And I had to get out of there. That bear gave me a spanking as the final insult. And at that moment I knew Bear Rock was no longer mine. But I took what I was feeling and tucked it in that special pain pouch in the pit of the stomach. And busied myself with Viking things, like exploding trees, and upgrading my armor. Then I spent some time to really think about how long it would take me to get to the Elder from my island. It looked really far, and would likely be a dangerous journey. I was thinking I could get pumped and motivated for it with a little admiration from my bear. But something was off. Maybe it was just me. Yeah, it was probably just me. I started day 23 with a little northern exploration. Even though the Elder was to the south, I wanted to scout out what other biomes were close by. I had a nice looking swamp up there. I also spotted some coastal copper, which I was noting on my map, when I realized that I had strayed a little too close to some plains. So I nervously navigated away from there. I'm always worried about those mosquitoes. They can aggro from the coast. Then I just tucked in and enjoyed some sailing. And eventually, I spotted the trader on my map. So I decided to go put down a portal while I was here. And immediately upon meeting him, I could tell him and I were cut from the same scrap of leather. And I checked out what he had for sale, even though I knew I didn't have enough for the one thing that I wanted. The Megan and Jord belt, which would increase my weight capacity. Then, as I was looking around a little bit, shooting the sea breeze with the trader here, I spotted something. And I didn't think it was possible. How did his rug have the same expression on it? That thought kind of stayed with me while I gathered carrots that evening. And crunched up some skeletons while I looked for money to afford the belt. Day 24 was a lot of dumpster diving for spare change in the burial chambers. I was trying to save up some more scratch for that Majingajord belt. I also squeezed in some more farming, and cycled in a new recipe roster I was working with. I was getting really into the carrot soup Queen's Jam minced meat sauce mix. And then I was looking for some room to place down the adze to upgrade my forge. And I realized this little cabin of mine was getting pretty cramped. Then I had the perfect storm for nervous system destruction. I mean, I was so focused on shooting that skeleton. And then I was just so still watching that troll destroy the forest. It took me minutes to recover from what happened next. These shaman, I tell ya. That axe was mercy after what he just did to me. And of course that aggroed the troll. I'll tell you one thing, I had very little fun diving burial chambers for the rest of the night. Now, it could have been that there was just some residual spooky in the air, but the morning of day 25, it just didn't bode well. It was like a mediocre, like a medium bode. Which is weird because I finally had enough coins to buy one of those Majinka Bard belts. So it should have actually realistically been like a top tier premium bode. So I don't know, something had me off. Like my bodometer was completely out of sync. Anyway, I got back to sailing out of there. With my new belt around my waist, I was ready to head to the Elder. And I was really way off on that boating for the day, because I got to sail under quite the night sky. The next day was just a lot of sailing in a lot of different conditions, and getting pretty beat up by the ocean. I was really happy to finally see the Elder's altar later that night. The next day, I set up a portal in some ruins close to the altar, and crafted up a bunch of batches of fire arrows. And then you know what I did? I took a really good look at my bear rug, and I think I was finally starting to get it. I think this bear rug was sassing me. Sassing with little touches of dogging condescension I could read all over his face. But I had no time to deal with that sassy condescension, as I was burning daylight, and I would need it to avoid any troublemaking this forest might try to throw at me while I'm dealing with the boss. I went ahead and cast the ancient seeds to the flame, took a deep breath of that pink flatus, and readied myself in position for the Elder of the Forest. And you know what? This big tree and his big shoulder pads still went up in flame by the resin of my arrow. And even when his roots surrounded me, I stayed focused. And yeah, sure, he hit me with that accusatory finger pointing once or twice. And tried to squish me like a little bug. But his accusations were nothing to me. And I pulled him out by the root. Then I collected on what I was there for. The Elder Trophy for Odin, but the Swamp Key was for me. I was then excited to see myself as the de facto ruler of the Black Forest. And I set a troll ablaze to commemorate the celebration. Through fog and forest, I made my way to the Hitless Stones the next day, and reluctantly hung my Elder's head on that stone. He certainly had a face only Mother Nature could love. But again, only Odin gets to enjoy looking at him. This Odin character better have something pretty for me when all's said and done. Anyway, I took a good look at this big-boned bone mass who I was supposed to take out next. And then I spent the rest of the day mining around the Elder's altar, as I didn't want to head back with an empty boat. And actually, that's all I pretty much did for day 29 as well. A lot of copper and a lot of tin. And I set sail that night with a full boat, and full confidence that I had looted that forest of all that it was worth. And the locals even came to see me off. But on the way home, I gave any swamps I saw a wide berth as I passed. I know how dangerous those can get at night, and I wasn't excited about the next phase of this adventure. The wind was definitely not in my sails on day 30. It was actually kind of painful. Every direction that I had to go seemed to be the opposite of the way the wind was blowing. And it wasn't exactly a short trip. But I stuck it out and made it home that night. On day 31, I did some farming and placed a cooler down to upgrade my forge. And I used it to put some big and beefy bronze upgrades on my pick, axe, and shield. And then I made a mead kettle, as I had realized I was behind on making poison resistance meads to get myself into the swamp. Then I threw those into the fermenter, and I think it was supposed to take about 2 days. And as tempting as it sounded to stand there and watch it ferment, I busied myself with some stuff around the base. I figured it was time to get more furniture around to increase my rested buffs. Because, as every Viking knows, there is nothing more relaxing than cluttering up your space. Then that night, while I was gathering some fine wood, an old familiar foe showed his face once again. But the stakes were different this time, as I would be losing more than just a black forest outpost if I gave in and backed down. And I had slaughtered countless passive forest creatures to make this island my own. I'd fight for it. And if that's not the most righteous cause to get behind and fight for, I don't know what is. And with that big and beefy bronze buckler I had just upgraded, I brought the fight back to that 3-star brute. I was becoming the Viking I always knew I was. And I couldn't wait to rub it in the face of that condescending, sassy bear. Because it seems I wasn't just getting better at fighting. I was becoming a more humble and less petty person. It's called character growth, and anyone as amazing as me would try it sometime. The next day I kept up with more of my menial tasks. Those smelters were thirsty babies and constantly going through wood. And then I set off for that swamp I had spotted earlier. Although my poison mead wasn't ready, I figured I could set up a base camp with a portal at least. So I parked my boat just south of the swamp and headed in on foot. And as I got deeper into this meadows biome, I saw what I suspected was a Draugr village, on account of it being a village and also having Draugr in it. I had to proceed with a little bit of stealth, as these Draugr hit really hard. But I fought them heroically anyways. I shot them with my arrows while they were stuck in their own homes. The next day I got back to weapons manufacturing, as these stubborn Draugr had drained me of all my arrows. And then, as I was returning to the village, I stopped in a little field to finish a thought. What if I slowly propagandized the Draugr into believing in philosophies centered around hyper-individuality, and convinced them that any sort of tribal behavior was primitive, unenlightened, and downright immoral? They'd stop protecting each other, and I could take them out one by one without wasting a single arrow. Divide and conquer at its finest. But then I remembered I only have 100 days, so I went with the arrows. They were simple and wasteful, but effective. I was now the mayor of my new village, and I enjoyed having somewhere new to get my rested buff. And I'd think about patching the roof later. It's not like anyone would invade me by shooting arrows down through it. On day 34, I made more arrows, because where I was going, there was a lot more to worry about than Draugr. And I think I had my bodometer fixed up, because I was getting some real clear readings on this one. The first time you enter a swamp with only bronze armor, never bodes well. The rain started and hit me with the wet debuff. And then a little leech snuck up on me. Oh, but that was the least of my worries. I was now engaged with an abomination. I was able to block his octopus beak attack thing, but my, how his forehand was heavy. I then saw him ragdoll a grayling just for fun, which actually looked pretty fun, to be honest. But if he wanted to try to have fun with me, he'd have to pay. I mean, like with his life, though. And yeah, it sounded weird. Anyway, I took him out. And then I went along and collected all his goodies and was thinking, yeah, the rest of the day probably boded pretty well. But then there was this one Draugr. Just happened to hear about what I had done to his village. Yeah, he was a 2-star. Did I mention he was a 2-star? Yeah, he wasn't happy about it. So yeah, he had fun with me free of charge. And then things went dark. But they couldn't stay dark because the sun comes in the morning. And on day 35, I had a thirst for revenge. I would just have to figure out how to get it without my upgraded armor and weapons. I could see him over there, but that 2-star Draugr could also see me. I tried a block, which didn't work. A slash that was more like a scratch. So I figured I'd tire him out with a little jog first. And maybe the undead have no lungs or something? Because he did not seem to be tiring. So I moved on to plan Y. Have someone else do all my fighting for me. And I found a Grey Dwarf to be the perfect candidate. I was running back to the swamp and the Draugr didn't seem to be following me. I was really glad I didn't have to go to plan Z. Nobody wants to see that. Anyway, I found my gear and immediately felt stronger, which was good, because that Draugr was on my heels again. And what a commendable fighter he was. You gotta respect the guy. And even though I planned to rewrite the history of that village to where him and his people never existed in the first place, I'd probably feel slightly guilty just remembering him. But to the victor go the spoils. And the rights to history. On day 36, I emerged from the cabin my great-great-grandfather had built with his bare imaginary hands. And I got back to swamping because that death of mine had really set me back. From a blob I slayed, I got my hands on some tasty-looking ooze I couldn't wait to start cooking with. And it looked like there was more fun on the menu as well, as there was another abomination in between me and all the crypts I was trying to get to. But I had already proven myself on his kind, and was able to make short work of him. Then I tucked in for what started as a nice quiet night of fine wood chopping. It often feels like that's how most bad things start in Valheim. Some eerie music playing in a tranquil moonlit night. That is, after all, when you'd least suspect something. Least of all for the ground to start shaking under your feet. And it was shaking, only I couldn't see which way they'd be coming from. Until I spotted them just behind my cabin. And I thought I'd be fine with just this one. Oh, but I lost all confidence when I saw that 2-star coming. I had to be so careful. That 2-star could one-shot me. I decided to lead him off my island to minimize the damage to my base. But another troll came in to cut off my roots like they were hunting me. The timing of it all was making me think this was some sort of justice for what I had done to that village. Or my island. Or their black forest. Yeah, maybe the list is long. But regardless, if pure justice is what these trolls were after, show me a victim here in Valheim with clean hands. This island was mine now. And they can send raid after raid. And I'll watch them burn. Because I know how to make flaming arrows from grayling resin. I'm pretty amazing. And my beard is majestic. So they can throw their boulders. Eventually I'll have them on the run. Just like this guy. Who was now actually on the run. And I almost lost him in this fog. And I really did not want to let him go. After all he had put me through? No. I found him. And cued the end to the music. And then, all of a sudden, the shaking began to fade. So I headed back to my island. But then a whole new pure-blooded one-star troll and his compatriot came out of absolutely I have no idea where. And I fought them all the way into the next day. Because after all, like I said, this is my island. And I cued music end one more time. And then I made some Queen's Jam. And then I got myself back into that swamp. Because I needed to start my iron game. And there's really only one place you can get iron. I just had to secure that place a little first. But everyone knows I'm talking about the sunken crypts. A place that I never hesitate even a little bit before entering. I just go right in. And I walk in like I own the place. Not inching my way forward. I mean, what is there to worry about when it comes to close quarters combat with enemies that outgun your armor? Not much, that's what I say. Anyway, I found my first fat stack of iron. 25 of them. It's a good thing I had my Majinga Bard belt for back support, or I wouldn't have been able to carry them all. I also got a few more to top me off from the muddy scrap piles. And found the veggie viscer for bone mass. I was happy to see he wasn't a 3-kilometer trip away like the Elder, but was actually in this very swamp with me. Then I placed all my iron inside chests outside the crypt and headed home for the night. I was also really excited because I now had enough materials to hang a spice rack. And that would drastically increase my culinary repertoire, which means recipes in Italian. And I started with the big heavy hitters, the sausages. And I did everything in my power to not think too hard about where those ingredients were sourced from. The next day, I was back in the sunken crypts looking for iron. And just like real life, when you really want something, you gotta step outside your comfort zone and put yourself in front of 2 axe-wielding undead Vikings. That's a surefire Oki-approved recipe for success. Put it in your repertoire and you'll see. Oh, and you gotta face your fears too. And for me in Valheim, that's the Wraiths. Many years ago, my first horrific death was at their hands. 2 of them. They attacked me while I was on my boat. I was too far off the coast and never recovered my stuff. And some would argue that I just never recovered. Oh, but hey, I got a chain off this one. And speaking of masking pain through material possessions, on day 39, I took a good look at all my iron. I was definitely making the numbers go up. And I figured that was enough iron to start carefully porting it back to my boat through the swamp. I knew it was going to take me a few long trips as I didn't want to park my boat in the swamp yet. I don't think I'd feel ready for that until I had a full set of iron armor. And I was really wishing I had a set of iron armor for this last trip back to the boat. I never liked running through the swamp at night, but I was really trying to make good time. So I had to do what I had to do, and I'm glad I did it, because eventually I was in the clear and pulling away from my swamp expedition with a boat full of iron. I spent the next day's sunrise rowing into the wind, and going so slow gave me a little more time to think about that tree in the sky. But why would I think about a literal celestial tree floating in the sky when I had iron? A lot of it, actually. And you might figure the first thing I do with all that iron is get to making the armor, or maybe a weapon. But no. I made something even more powerful. The Cutter of Stones. Or the Stone Cutter, for short. And with that puppy, I was able to start the fortification of my island. And that fortification, according to my plan, was going to be very... fortified, I think the word is. Yeah, fortified. And I was starting to feel really safe here. And I dare say, I saw a hint of jealousy on the face of my bear rug that night. He was speechless. The next day was a little bit of farming at the beginning, but I quickly descended into the madness that was my fortification wall. It pretty much consumed me. Like, I got really into it. But you know what? By nightfall, I was glad that I did get into it, because I was able, for the first time, to start enjoying the peace that only comes from being slightly elevated and behind a wall. The next day, I kept up with my new addiction of base building and fortifying, and land sculpting, and resupplying myself with lots of stone, as I was doing so much building. And that night was actually a really big night, as I completed the crafting of my new set of iron armor. And snazzy would be an understatement of the way I was looking. I started day 43 with a little quarrying of some stone, which smoothly transitioned into me learning that despite having iron armor, a 1-star bear still hits hard enough for me to run away. Still got that stone though, so I did some building with that. And the place was starting to look really good. Then that night I crafted up an iron mace and upgraded it, as it is my tool of choice against the upcoming bone mass. And I even upgraded all my iron armor up to level 2. I started the next day in my home village where I was definitely born. And I was all set for a very docile and uneventful day, which would be run-of-the-mill for a small village boy like myself. And maybe to some of you city slickers, it still would be an uneventful day. But only if you consider building the world's greatest and most amazing and biggest ship in the world uneventful. Then yeah, I guess in that case it was an uneventful day. Day 45. There I was, sailing off on a Viking ship. My Viking ship that I built, and I was feeling pretty good about. Then I pulled that ship up next to the swamp, and through sheer force of will, secured myself a nice little outpost on the coast. And of course that was contested by the people of the swamp, as I was getting closer to their leader. And speaking of their leader, on day 46 I finally came across the bone mass altar. It was conveniently right beside another sunken crypt. So I built another nice little outpost up on top of that crypt too. And what happened next? Well, I don't mean to stroke my own majestic beard here, but it's kind of like I had this genius intuition to throw a poison resistance meat on while going into a sunken crypt. I know, it's kind of an abstract concept, but I came up with it just in time. And if I hadn't, it would have been lights out with a greeting crowd like this. The next morning, I tallied 3.5 stacks of iron that I had gathered the night before. Then I took out a giant 1-star oozer, and he dropped a nice cache of delectable ooze. I did some pleasant turnip gardening, and got started on some wall layouts I had in mind for a much bigger and ambitious base. And speaking of ambitions, I had some ambitions to face off with bone mass soon. So I started prepping the arena by doing stuff like leveling the ground, because bone mass in his very toxic nature fears nothing more than a good even footing. And I intended to use that deep lore knowledge against him. And I spent the rest of the night cinematically leveling up my mace skills in preparation for the fight. On the morning of day 48, I stared at my bear rug for a while. But I just ended up having debates with myself on topics like the metaphysics of cuisine, or whether labeling everything a social construct was itself a social construct. But I couldn't think about it for too long, as I had some bone broth to get brewing. So I cast those withered bones into the pot and cut loose the pink gas of bone mass. And what a beauty he was. I started with the old pocket ace that is my fire arrows, but they did basically nothing. He had a forehand breath combo going, and would even sometimes throw out armpit minions, which I would always try to take care of first. And though it seemed like I had a pretty solid start, my rested buff was almost a third gone, and I was not keeping up. Ooh, but he was. And it felt like he had me on the run for a while. And that wasn't exactly the worst of it, because in prepping everything for this recipe, I forgot to bring my health potions. And that poison, it was really holding me back. I could not afford to miss a single block. Actually, I was afforded just one, and then I took him out. I got the bone mass trophy out of the deal, and the wishbone, so I can now find silver. I headed out of the swamp, and that night I got back to the spawn stones, where I reluctantly hung the beautiful big bone mass trophy. And then I took a good look at my next target, the mother dragon of the mountain, Motor. On day 49, I was feeling super confident now that I'd taken bone mass out. It felt like I owned these swamps now. So you can imagine how paradigm popping a 3-star arrow to the back of the head would feel in a moment like that. The paradigm was completely popped. So I scurried on out of that crypt. And you might be wondering, what does a little Viking boy do after such a tragic fall from the heights of Mount Olympus? And because you were wondering that, I will tell you. I got back in that crypt and decided that I would take back my honor. But after 2 shots from that 3-star, I decided I'd go with plan B. And I'll spare you the nitty-gritty details, but the by and large of the plan was that I would spend the next 4 days gathering as much iron as I could from all the other crypts I could find in this swamp. And just completely avoid that 3-star altogether. And I mean, don't get me wrong, there were still a couple moments of challenge throughout these days. Other 3-stars were encountered. I was just able to finesse and cheese them a little better. Remember, I lost all my shame in cheesing way back in the Black Forest. And this swamp had taken quite a toll on me too. Even though I had beaten bone mass, I went from Oki the bear slayer to Oki the ooze and entrail eating little Viking boy. How quickly a Viking can lose himself in this Valheim. But hey, look at that, a couple days went by, and I had a whole new set of feelings that went along with my whole new boatload of iron. And I was looking forward to not having to see the gloomy rain of the swamp for quite some time. I mean, you could read the excitement all over this little Viking face of mine. Look at this. I even planted a new garden. Got the turnips going and everything. It was just a good day. Even my bear rug had a look on his face like something good was going to happen. And I took that as a sign. Today would be the day I look for my first vein of silver. And I'd look for it on that little mountain on my home island. I was just waiting to hear that ping. Eventually, I saw a little 2-star wolf in the distance. And my instinct was to run, but then I remembered I have fire arrows. And with the backstab bonus, that would definitely be enough to take out this wolf. I just had to not miss. And not gonna lie, after I missed and saw him getting bigger and bigger as he approached, I got a little nervous. But not to worry, nothing a few well-timed parries couldn't fix. Although it would seem 2-star wolves just kind of bite through the shield. And nobody could have seen that coming. Other than maybe this bear rug of mine. I interrogated him about any foreknowledge, but I got no answers. I then apprehensively ascended the mountain in my old bronze gear and noticed the wolf was still out on the attack. I bravely hid behind a stone and waited for a good time to go in. And then, after spotting the perfect chance to grab my stuff, I heroically made my way back down the mountain. On day 55, I messed around with some new building ideas. I needed something to help me procrastinate from going back up into the mountain. You know, because like the newfound fear of 2-star wolves and all. But I knew I had to approach this in some sort of healthy way. So I started by hurling bear slurs at my rug. And it worked great. Very cathartic. But I still knew I had to get back up on that mountain and face my fear. And there it was howling. And that sure was enough to make me move on. I had checked over there for silver anyways. And then you wouldn't believe I ran into another 2-star wolf. 2 on one mountain. And I figured there'd probably be no silver in that direction either. So I kept looking. And eventually the hairs of my leather stood on edge as I heard a growl. Nothing to fear though, just a no-star. And it would be the first wolf pelt of my adventure. I then decided on upgrading my arsenal, as I had a lot more iron now. And I started with a shield that I hoped a 2-star wolf couldn't bite through. Even slapped an upgrade on it. And I went with the iron sword as well. I'd start leaning into it a lot more to get my damage output. On day 56, I ascended another small mountain I'd found on my starting island. I had level 3 iron gear, and my newly equipped sword and shield. I felt like there was nothing this mountain could throw at me that I couldn't handle. It sure was much steeper than the last one though. A bit of a tough climb. At the peak, I found a monumental stone etched with warnings. But that couldn't be for me, not with all the upgrades I had. But the hungry for meat part may have triggered slight reflections. But hey, I found my first batch of obsidian, and that would really open up my arrow game. I encountered my first drake of the adventure, and it was a 1-star. And then I found a cave entrance, and I thought about going in, but figured I'd save it for another day. I was still looking for silver. But didn't have much luck. So on the morning of day 57, while roasting up a wolf shank, I decided that today would be that day that I go into the caves. Because actually, more than anything, I was hoping to find a Veg visor in there that would give me the location of Motor. So I got prepped for going in by crafting up a whole bunch of poison arrows with some of that obsidian I had found. And surprisingly, some of that very palatable ooze too. And then the unfortunate thing was when I got up there, a snowstorm had started. It makes every little movement you make a little more stressful, as you never know what's going to pop out of it. You just find yourself in random encounters like you've been walking through some Pokemon grass or something. But after all that stressful traveling, I finally got to the cave. And for absolutely no reason at all, I figured it would be less stressful in there. And then despite that perfectly well substantiated belief, it was actually very stressful. Cultists just kept popping out of everywhere. And they'd try to sell me on this new age conflagration meditation stuff, which maybe I could have gotten into. But they also said I had to swear off any eating of ooze. And nobody, and I mean nobody, comes between a Viking and his ooze repertoires. I stayed in that cave even into the next day, and fought off all the ooze-hating assailants I came across. And that's not to say they didn't almost get me, because they almost got me. First they caught me between a cross plume of their flames. A whole horde of them chased me about the cavern, and nearly got me at 13 health. I got my ooze-riddled flesh out of there just in time. And speaking of time, I took some. to heal up and change my tune. I wasn't about to let these ooze haters get the best of me. So I got back in there like a good Viking. And you know what I did? I took every last one of their weird hair and toenail collections. And then the downside was I didn't find any Vegivessers. So I was no closer to finding Motor's location. Bummer. I started day 59 with a little trip to the swamp. I needed more surtling cores so that I can make more portals. And I needed more portals because I was about to go on a journey to find a new mountain. And then that night I found a new mountain. A pretty big one too, just south of my home island. On day 60 I began my ascent up the new mountain. And you know what? It didn't take long before that wonderful vibrous sound of the wishbones started chirping. And I followed that sound until I ran into a 1-star golem. And iron gear is strong, but it's not that strong. I kept moving higher towards the peak, as I figured I'd get a better vantage point from up there. And the view was great. I couldn't see any motor from up here, but this sure was a big mountain. And then I decided, I'm going to make this little castle my own. It would do well as the perfect mountain outpost. And not only that, but I found a silver vein right up close to it too. And I heard the wolves howl in terror, as they knew their days had just been numbered. Anyway, I got to picking at it, and I did that pretty much all day. And right up into the evening, actually. Yeah, let's just say I got home that night with pockets full of stones. Now, something happened on day 61, and you might label me a conspiracy theorist for this, but I think the wolves knew that I had struck silver. I can't prove it, but the timing was just too perfect. Me, all on my lonesome, strolling back to my mining site, just to see that I'm being hunted? It's clear it had everything to do with me finding my first silver vein, but I had no time to think of that. I had to find somewhere safe and fast. Luckily, what came to mind was an ancient axiomatic proverb. When wolf are hunting, stand on slab. And you know what? That did the trick. All this time, all I had to do was stand on a slab. And I'm glad I did. There were a lot of wolves. I guess the good part is I don't have to go hunting any boar after this. I wasn't sure what a Viking was supposed to do with so much wolf fur. A rug and a cape, I guess? Anyway, I now knew the wolves were onto my mining operation and actively trying to thwart it. On day 62, I chopped a lot of wood because I would be needing a lot. I'd have to make a lot of arrows for this war of the wolves after all. And speaking of the wolves, it was time for me to get my silver out of there. And it was a steep and dangerous descent to get down from this mountain. Because it was very slippy. It was a very slippy mountain. And the ground could just get out from under you. But I was careful. And I ported that silver back to my ship all day. The next morning, I was finishing bringing the last load of silver down from the mountain. And I felt a great sense of accomplishment in that. After all, this mountain was huge. Maybe the biggest ever, I was thinking. But then I noticed the one across the bay. And it looked like double the size of this one. Hopefully I never have to go there, I thought. And then I set sail, silver in hand and a smile on my face. And then, because it was day 63 and I already had a huntsman bow, I was actually excited when I saw my first serpent of the playthrough. I already had a big stack of wolf shanks, so some serpent meat to go with that would be the gravy on my biscuit. On the morning of day 64, I arrived back at my home island, and there I got that silver a-smelting. And I was really excited about all the things I'd be making with it. And some may say that it changed me, but I don't think it changed me at all. Then I spent some time explaining to my bear rug why he was low value and I was high value. And speaking of high value, I decided it was time to spruce up the place with more than a bear rug. So I dusted off the old Eikthyr head and hung it on one of my new walls. And I really liked it. It seemed to unlock some deep Viking instinct in me, and I knew I needed more. So I came up with a plan to do something about that. The next day, my plan was in full swing, and I had lots of wall space now. It just needed a couple touches of trim as well. I got Eikthyr's head back up, and it was looking great. This was a good start to what would become the best trophy wall ever. But the funny thing about trophies is they don't all have to be hung on walls. So that night, I crafted one of my finest pieces yet, the wolf fur cape. And because I wanted to get a good look at it, I decided to set up some sconces. And now we come back to my conspiracy theory. And you may still think it's all just coincidence. But wouldn't you agree that it's a little bit strange? That the moment I masquerade the carcass of a wolf on my shoulder, my home is attacked by drakes? A cold wind blew down from the mountain, and I was caught a little off guard because these drakes come in quick. I went for the first one I saw, but I wasn't really sure how many I should expect. And they not only caught me off guard, but they caught me with a hungry tummy. And of course I spotted that after one of them hit me with a glowing ice ball. And then I snacked up and got back in the fight. And I was thinking the wolves must have sent the drakes here after encountering my impenetrable slab technique. Which of course would never work on these very mobile foes. So I had no choice but to stay light on my feet and strike back with perfect timing. I once again defended my island. And I got some drake trophies out of the deal too. The next day, I had to deliberate with myself a little bit. I had a limited amount of silver, and although I really wanted to spend that on a drake helmet, I opted for a Draugr instead. I was thinking the extra poison damage would add to the poetry of my toxic revenge against the wolves of this world. And Draugr just sounded like a really cool name. On day 67, I really wanted to work on my boss trophy collection. I already had Eikthyrs head, but that was it. So I figured it was time I pay the Elder another visit. I warmed up my Draugr by clearing the mobs around the altar. Then I called him out, and actually wore him down pretty fast. This Draugr had a nice bite to it. And just like that, my walls had more boss heads on them. This place was going to look way better than Odin's spawn stones. Day 68 was actually really big, because I finally had a big stack of silver to spend on some wolf hide armor. I got the trousers and the chest piece, and I upgraded both of them to level 3. I then posed up in front of my trophies like a poser. No, I don't. I could tell they were jealous. Let's just put it that way. And then later that night, I set sail to go back to the mountain. On the morning of day 69, I watched the sun rise over the mountain. I had a brand new set of armor and weapons, and it felt like a hopeful day. And I got readings on a brand new vein of silver. But of course, they wouldn't let me have it that easy. They put up quite a fight as their incessant harassment began. A 1-star wolf even got me on the run. He had me cornered with no stamina, so I let him have the fisticuffs. And the stone golem finished him off for me. I tried to get back to that silver vein again. But that stone golem was only a useful ally when our mutual enemies were around. Otherwise, he just kept hunting me. and eventually a drake tattletaled on where I was hiding. The stone golem followed and just kept coming for me, and I realized I wouldn't get that silver vein without taking him out. But I just didn't know how. It would take so many arrows, and he was able to get to everywhere I went. He followed me into the evening and up the mountain. And I knew slabs wouldn't work with him as he was just too tall. So I went with the old pillar of earth technique up on the top of that mountain. And from there I rained down my arrows upon him. And it took a long time, and a lot of arrows. But I was finally rid of him. On day 70, I figured I'd get a lot done when it came to that silver vein. And it did start out pretty well. But there was just something about the creatures of that mountain. They were so nosy. It felt like I couldn't get more than a couple picks in. And then they'd be on me like entrails on rice. If it wasn't the wolves, it was the drakes. And if it wasn't the drakes, it was the wolves. But by day 71, I was still able to get all the silver out of that vein. And not far off, I even found a new one. And then a wolf tried to sneak up on me. He just didn't know I'd been working on my jump shot. He actually couldn't handle it and completely ran away. By day 72, my ship was starting to look fat on the silver stacks. Almost 7.5 of them to be exact. And because I couldn't possibly think of needing more than that, I set sail on my way home. On day 73, I had to get back to the manual labor of wood chopping. My stores had run dry and I needed a lot of charcoal for all this silver I'd brought back. Not to mention the gigantic roof I was putting on my new building. It sure was coming together. My old building fit right inside of it. And I had this skylight next to my trophy area. I wasn't sure what to do with it, but I kind of liked it how it was. The next day I began the demolition of my old building. I had no use for it anymore as my new building was fully enclosed. It was a very precise demolition. I made sure not to destroy any chests until I was good and ready to move their contents. And I made the place a little more comfortable when it came to fine cuisine making. My repertoires were in full bloom. And then the piece of resistance, which I saved for last. I still remember the battle when I took his head. And that night as I stared into his eyes, I realized, I think I'm just really bad at reading the facial expression of bears. But maybe I'd get better at it, because now I'd be staring at his face from my new throne. I began day 75 by getting my crafting tables back up and operational. And I was really enjoying all this extra space I had. And then for some reason, don't ask me why, but I decided today was going to be the day I was going to explore that mountain. And it was an inevitability. But within 5 seconds, I was being attacked by everything. Luckily, I had my boy Stone Golem over there take the drakes while I took the wolves. It was a tag team made in mountain heaven. But I quickly moved on and ran away so I could search more ruins. And you know what I found? At the time, I had no idea that these enemies could go up to 5 stars. And I was thinking I got lucky again because it could have been an archer. Or maybe something worse, like an enemy that could fly around and one-shot me from a distance. Yeah, like a 5-star drake or something. Oh, I can tell you, I was nervous fighting this guy. I figured every one of those shots was a guarantee to take me out. And I was so far from my portal, I didn't think there was a chance I'd make it back here with my old armor. All I know is my heart was pumping and I had to keep those poison arrows flying. And I was pleased to see that I could finagle that drake into a forever nap. And you know what? You'd figure that was the worst this mountain adventure could throw at me. But then I finally got to the highest peak on the mountain and was slapped with the bad news that there was no mother of dragons in sight. And then, for absolutely no reason, I decided I had enough sunlight to go explore and try to find another veggie visor in some of these ruins, which nearly led me to ruin. I mean, I found myself in a firefight with a drake, and then he hits me with a 1-2-3 combo, and then out of my blind spot comes a stone golem, and then I'm running for my life for the rest of the evening. But then finally my luck turns and I find a mountainside castle. And I mean, I had to clear it out a little bit and add something to warm up the buns. But it was better than nothing, because there was no way I was making it back for the night. So I locked the front door to keep the werewolves out and stood guard in my one-time use nocturnal prison. On day 76, you know what? You'd figure I'd be done with all these close calls. I mean, I headed out pretty cautiously with the sign of first light. But then again, it didn't take long for me to be running for my life from another golem. But then you know what I thought? In this life, there's only so much you can take. And this golem was acting like he owned the mountain or something. I had pretty good gear by now, and I was thinking I could take him. So I timed the first block perfectly, but I guess it didn't bedazzle him enough because I couldn't get in for a hit, and he ended up hitting me. I even tried it one more time and still I just couldn't get in for the hit. So he left me no choice. I had to move on to my next plan, which was to get back up on this tower. And of course, I made the steps too big. He sent me flying with a haymaker and nearly killed me. And then that wasn't the end of it, because at this point he decided to just twist the knife. And he tried to do me like they did me at Bear Rock. It could not have been any closer, me getting through that portal. But the sad news was I was now a mountain man without a mountain outpost. And I think Bear Rug got a really good kick out of that. Oh, but I'd show him. I made a silver sword and a drake helmet. And the cherry on top was that I upgraded both of them. I had put all of my Viking boy ways behind me, and now I was a mean-looking Viking man. The next day I went to Haldor for absolutely no reason, I think. I mean, I went to buy something, but I couldn't remember what I wanted to look at when I got there. But in the end, it was just wasting time from what I really had to do, which was go find myself a new mountain. And yeah, I guess there was no better mountain than the big one across the bay. So I set myself up a landing there to prepare to tackle it the next day. And yeah, it looked way bigger when I was up close, and I was definitely not intimidated. So the next day I headed out at sunrise and took another quick look at the mountain. And I may have whispered once or twice to myself that I was a Viking man and my beard was majestic. And you know, I think it might have been the biggest mountain I had ever climbed in Valheim. But the funny thing about the biggest mountain we're ever faced with climbing is that it's always worth it. And the reason this one was worth it is because after I ascended to the peak and was able to look down at the rest of the mountain, I got a clear shot view of the source of all of those conspiring against me. Yeah, that's right. The altar of Moder. But I mean, come on. It's not like I can just walk up to the altar and fight him right away. I had to prepare. And realistically, these preparations would take days. I had to get my food game on point, so I had to get stuff like serpent stew to boost my health. And ooh la la au revoir, my French onion soup was almost ready as my first batch of onions came in. Oh, and I had to fight my way through that mountain still. I mean, finding the altar was one thing, but I had to collect a lot of dragon eggs. And by a lot I mean 3. But I also had to prep the arena. First, for the actual boss fight, but also so that if I get attacked by wolves out here, I'd have somewhere safe to jump up to. And then later that night, I turned on my wishbone, as I hadn't had it on for a while, and I found that I had built my mountain peak earthen fortress right on top of a silver vein. But of course, mining it drew the attention of a nearby stone golem, and I was pleased to see that the likes of him would never get past these impenetrable earthen walls. On day 80, I was mentally prepped and ready to fight Moder. But my stores of feathers were unfortunately not. So I spent the entire day hunting seagulls. I crept out from behind my safe walls in the early morning. I had tons of arrows and I was ready. I just needed to grab one more egg. And that egg was only protected by a few drakes. Easy peasy, I was thinking. Oh, but then that singular wolf appeared. And then his 2-star accomplice. And then, well, things quickly devolved from there. And unfortunately, death wasn't the worst part. Because when I demolished my old building, I destroyed my old bed. So I respawned back at the stones. And I could feel them staring at me. At my squishy Viking body. At my failure. But then I remembered this squishy Viking body had slain them. And I'd have one more joining them soon. So I went back and got my stuff. And then stewed a little on my throne. And next day, I went to getting that final egg. And contrary to their best efforts, I did get it. But there wasn't enough daylight to start the fight just yet. So I continued to slow cook my revenge. And I could see they knew I was coming and they were getting desperate. And if they thought they had seen it all with my ancient slab technique, they were blown away by the 4D chess of my earthen wall. But I dealt with them, and I cleared their kind around the altar too. After all, I couldn't have them interfering on what would be the greatest attack on their leadership ever. And then I broke pink wind as I called out Moder, Mother of the Dragons. And wow, I sure had a sloppy start as I just could not hit this dragon. But she sure as shooting was shooting me. Yeah, she was a sassy one. And I could tell by the temper she was behind all the hunts. My conspiracy theory was vindicated in this old dragon. And I let this old dragon feel the heat of my fire arrows. As best as she tried, she just couldn't get away from him. And finally she gave out her last cry before I left her in tears. And I collected 1 tear for me and 1 Moder trophy for Odin. And speaking of Odin, I got back to his stones that night. And I gotta say, of all the trophies I've put on these stones so far, I think the Moder one might be the nicest looking. And I dare say I may have been slightly envious. But I had to move on and fix myself on the next prize. Yagluth the Beauteous. On day 84, I began porting all the silver I had gathered from my mountain fortress. And you wouldn't figure that moving silver down a mountain is one of the most dangerous tasks you can do in Valheim. But this last round of Vanity Silver almost took my life. Like I said, those mountains can get slippy. After porting my last load of silver, I set sail. But this time, not for home, because I was on a time crunch. I really wanted to face Yagluth before day 100, so I would be heading straight for the plains. I parked my ship right up next to one of those copper deposits I had seen a long time ago. And then I inched my way from that black forest into those plains. And I was just so nervous. It was so foggy, and those desquitos make the foolhardy pay with their lives. And I could even hear the buzz of one of their wings. And I spotted it before it spotted me and took it out. But I knew I still had to be careful, as I spotted a 3-star just up the hill. Then I worked on raising some ground around what would be my future plains farm. And you know what? I even used it as a little hunting tower in the meantime before it was finished. Some fuelings did try to sabotage the operation, but I was able to take them down and collect my first little bit of black metal scraps. Also, despite feeling safe up on this raised ground, I still had to be careful. The next day, I continued inching my way forward through the plains. And you know, I felt like I was doing a good job spotting the desquito before they spotted me. Then later, I was working on my trophy walls, and the elder basically told me he was still butthurt about me chopping him down. But I didn't have much time to listen, as I had a leech trophy that would go perfect next to his face. Yeah, these trophy walls of mine were looking really nice. And that night, I also upped my arrow arsenal with the addition of the needle arrows. I continued fighting my way across the plains until I came across a tower, and I wanted it to be mine. So I started by clearing the exterior, and the inside too. And I placed down a portal to claim what was mine now. And you know what? I think I got too comfortable with my successes, because I wandered dangerously close to a tar patch, and a 3-star growth had me in his sights. I never realized that this already lethal interaction was about to become the battle for my tower. Because oh boy, now some desquitos were involved. And they swarmed me. Little old me and my little old tower, and I just couldn't catch a break. Until I actually caught a break, because I got one, and the other one actually did some damage on the growth for me. Oh, but he was pesky, and he almost knocked me off the tower. I eventually got him. And the growth. And you'd figure with nighttime coming I'd tuck in somewhere cozy. But again, I went and got comfortable with this tar patch. I think I felt pressured to keep progressing, day or night. But that pressure seemed to be pushing me more and more into dangerous situations. Desquitos poking at the hem of my cape. Fuelings hurling spears at my head. I mean, this one almost took my head clean off. Yeah, it turned into quite the day just to secure a tower. But from this tower, I was planning quite the blitzkrieg operation that I'd be running through these plains. On day 88, a whittling operation began, and my target was a fueling village. And my mission was most importantly to find flax. I'd need a lot of it if I was going to have a fully upgraded set of padded armor by the time I faced Yagluth. But going through these villages was tough, as I had to kite out small batches of enemies that I would take out from atop my rock. On day 89, all that whittling had paid off, as I found my first batch of flax. And of course, these fuelings did not let it go easy. But despite their best efforts, I had it planted in my plains garden that night. Having been so busy in the plains over the last few days, on day 90, I almost had a full plains collection of trophies. But at the same time, I couldn't lose sight of the practical progress I was trying to make. And I had a load of black metal scraps I'd shaken from the pockets of these fuelings, and it needed to get to my ship. So I opted for the old mule and cart technique. And I guess I had to be the mule. I also had to thoroughly defend myself, as it would seem the inhabitants of the plains did not want me to make off with all that metal, even though I had killed them fair and square for it. And one might think after getting all this black metal back to a ship already with its share of silver, that I'd head right back home with it. But actually what I needed more than anything right then was more iron to make the padded armor. So reluctantly, I'd be heading back to the swamp. And the leeches excitedly welcomed me back with open mouths. It didn't take long on day 91 for me to realize that I had gone overboard on the iron gathering. I had nearly filled a whole chest with it. And I'm glad I didn't get more, because by the time I had ported it all over, my ship was full. And with that, it was time to go. With all that iron, and not too much time, I had to get some extra smelters down. And I kept those things pumping. And then I indulged myself in the crybaby dragon's tears by building an artisan table. And that would unlock a whole new world of crafting possibilities for me. Like the spinning wheel, which I was a little ahead of the game on, but at least I'd have it down for when my flax was ready. And I even got the blast furnace going. So I was ready to start bending black metal into weapons of my choosing. Hey, and look at that. On day 93, I drained a tar pit. On day 94, I continued invading fueling villages. And by evening, I was pleased to see that a big round of flax had come in. I had been replanting all my harvests, but this one I was actually going to start using to make linen thread. And with that, I entered into the infamous Thread Age. Because everyone knows there is no armor more dangerous to your enemies than one you're comfortable in. On day 95, I finally had enough thread to start crafting with. So I started with the padded cuirass to cover my derriere. And it looked good. But what was not so good is that I had to go sailingly into the night. And I had to do that because I hadn't found a single veggie visor to give me Yag's location. So my only choice was just to sail out and look for his very large altar from the coasts. By the morning of day 96, I had made it out of the inner circle of biomes and was now into what I consider the danger zone. And although it's dangerous, you get to see some pretty cool sights out here, like the edge of the Mistlands, which always seems full of wonder and discovery. And speaking of discovery, I covered a lot of ground, or water, by the end of the day. And then finally, just as I was avoiding a big patch of Mistlands to the north, Yagluth's altar rendered into view. And I was excited to see that I would be facing him on day 100. But then, just as I was about to pull in to build a base camp, I saw the wolves were out for a little taste of revenge. And of course I didn't pull in, because that would be bad if they got me and I was stuck out here with no portal. I'd have no chance of recovering to face Yagluth by day 100. So I did the responsible thing and sailed away and waited for that hunt to end. And then later that evening as I pulled in, I figured the only thing that could really throw a wrench in my gears would be if I was swarmed by desquitos or something. And then look at that. I was swarmed by desquitos. And I can't say I wasn't on edge for this. It was do or die with these little flying deaths. So I did. And then I got the heck out of those plains for the night. Now that I had found the altar, on day 97 I got back to preparations for the fight, like upgrades on my gear, or a windmill to turn barley into tasty flour. And the secret about preparations that most people don't know is that they make you feel very prepared. And because of this preparedness feeling, I figured I had time to squeeze in one more boss trophy. So I went to mix in that brothy bone mass. And of course, being so well equipped, I minced him into quite the mess. And he was a bit of a unique trophy to add to my collection. But I guess he wasn't picking up on the social cues I was sending out, that it was time to stop making it jiggle. Day 98 was exciting as I began to prep Yagluth's arena. And to make matters even more exciting, I watched some lox pies bake. And yes, the suspense continued to build as I made an axe. Because even on day 99, a Viking is never above his beginnings. And you never really know when you're going to need more wood. And speaking of deep reflections as one approaches the end, I took some time to sit down with my bear and remind him that I still had way more silver than he did, and urged him to reflect on all my trophies of conquest. Yeah, and what a conquest it was. But because a Viking never treats it like it's over before it's already begun, I planted some turnips for the coming seasons. And then it's important to never forget that under all this padded armor is still a squishy Viking body. And you gotta treat it to a hot tub every now and again. But then all of a sudden it was day 100. And I started it by doing what any sane Viking would do. I ate poisonous berries and violently regurgitated all the contents of my stomach. Then I ate what would either be my last meal or the first of the rest of my life. But then again, isn't that the case for every meal? Anyway, after eating, it was time to let out some gas. That was actually kind of warm, because this Yagluth was known to be one hot tamale. And there he came bubbling up from the depths with a mighty roar. And then he raised his hand and called down the burning sky upon me. But little did he know at this point, I was a master of elevated earth. Then he tried to blast me with his mouth laser. But then all I saw was my opening, and I had to get behind him. And it turns out that I had found my sweet spot. And with my cozy padded armor and my fire resistance mead, I could stay there all day. Until he called down the sky again, and I'd obviously run for safety. But then sometimes, even in my little rat hole here, he'd seem to get me. But even one time when he really got me, and I was thinking he might turn me into a crispy boy, I shook the thought and kept hacking at him. Yeah, what can be said about the old Yagster here? I guess he was able to rule his fuelings with a mighty strong hand. And maybe scare them into obedience from time to time by making the sky fall. But that was all bells and whistles to the Viking that I had become. Because there was one thing the Yagster was about to learn about me. That under this armor, I was a Viking man, and my beard was majestic. And soon enough, all that was left of him was his head. And the really cool landscaping job that he had his fuelings do on this arena. Really creative imagination for such a hot tamale. And then, of course, I headed back to the hit list stones. And I could yet again feel them all staring. But this time, I felt no ounce of shame. And as I hung Yagi's head there for Odin, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment in what I had done over these 100 days. I held my island and did what I had to do. And yeah, I didn't get to all the bosses in the 100 days. But anyone that knows me knows there's one thing that always rings true. Though there may be big gaps between them, there will always be another full moon.